Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs and Independent Policy Institute based in London, carried out an independent and rigorous analysis of Ukraine's transformations after the Revolution of Dignity. The report is partly about country's struggle to hold together and to resist Russia's interference and pressure in the military, domestic, economic and media spheres. But it is also related to internal contests to determine the political, institutional and civic future of Ukraine. We are joined by Orysia Lutsevych, the manager of the Ukraine Forum in the Chatham House Russia and Eurasia program, to discuss the findings. Hi, Orysia. Thank you for joining us. Hello. So the first question, within the last 4 years, Ukraine has gone through massive changes and reforms, more than within 22 years of its previous independence history. Would you say this process was successful?
I think the process was successful, and I think Ukraine managed to transform more than any other post-Soviet republic, with the exception of the Baltic states that are already members of the European Union. And partially, the success of this transformation was thanks to very active and constructive role of Ukrainian civil society, activist volunteers, who took it part of their patriotic duty to reform Ukraine and to be an ally and partner of government, of new reformers in the parliament.
Okay, to your opinion, what reforms are the most important and what should be the priorities of the government in this sphere?
Well, definitely, if we look at what has been achieved in the last 4 years, the most important reform was the higher level of transparency of public governance, public finance, and the new anti-corruption infrastructure that Ukraine started to build with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, with the Agency for Prevention of Corruption, and with the e-declarations that all government officials had to file publicly. This whole system exposes a lot of corruption. It also starts investigation. But the next big step that Ukraine needs to really become a rule-based market economy is, of course, rule of law. Because I think Ukrainians also share the sentiment. There's no sense that Ukraine is a just society. There are people above the law, and it's very difficult for investors and companies to protect their property rights. So the next step that will determine whether Ukraine will continue on the reform path and be successful is court, judicial reform and establishment of anti-corruption courts.
Thank you. We know that recently Ukraine and EU has agreed for the financing by the European Union of the Ukrainian judiciary reform. In one of your statements you said, and especially in the report, you said that the EU strategy towards Ukraine is not very effective. How can it be improved and why is that?
It's a very important question because, you know, we must remember that as of 1st of September, EU-Ukraine Association Agreement and Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement entered into a force. So now this is a legally binding agreement where Ukraine takes certain responsibilities to reform in a political, in the economic, in the regulatory sphere. And European Union should be very vigilant in the oversight of this agreement. The EU-Ukraine Association Council, that is a special body that will oversee Ukraine's progress, has to work actively. And also, I think it's important to understand that Ukraine needs a much stronger domestic coordination agency for the implementation of the agreement. Now, what European Union can do, so to say, the carrots that are remaining, it is, of course, the funding that comes for implementation of reforms. So there has to be a strong conditionality, and the authors of the report, especially the chapter with regards to European integration, argue that more assistance should go through a special EU-Ukraine support group that is chaired by Peter Wagner, rather than through a special technical assistance projects that are very dispersed and very often ineffective, lack monitoring and concrete impact. So This is one of the recommendations. And also the authors urge for European Union to be more politically active in a way to push Ukrainian top government officials to obey by the obligations that Ukraine took as part of the DCFTA and the association agreement. This means more active role for the EU ambassador in Kiev, but also for top leaders of the European Union to engage with Ukrainian government, parliament on a higher level than before.
Thank you. I would also like to address one of these issues of civil society consolidation. Human capital is named as one of the most valuable assets in Ukraine's reform progress. Despite that, in one of your interviews, you said that for implementation of this big political reform, a great civil reform is a must. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean by that that Ukraine needs to change also from the bottom up. And as I've said at the beginning, the impressive change that Ukraine started, the overhaul of Ukrainian state, is partially thanks to active engagement and very constructive engagement of civil society. But also, we must remember the main function of a civil society in democracy, and that is structuring of citizens around specific interests, and that is also creating support networks among the citizens to defend and promote their rights. One of the weaknesses, the way I see it, of Ukrainian civil society, that it is too much focused on advocating and lobbying for change in the offices of the state, and is not spending enough time talking to the citizens and building consensus. So my suggestion is that at the time of, digital society, so much social media, so much information, citizens need to come face to face and discuss important issues, because that cannot be replaced just by Facebook discussion. So civil society organizations, community groups have to convince citizens to talk about healthcare reform, decentralization, and they should also build linkages between small and medium enterprises and active citizens. Because as we describe a case of Prozoro, the public procurement reform in Ukraine, it happened partially because there was a model that was working in the marketplace, and that this model was borrowed by the state basically to perform its public procurement. So these ideas could come for how to modernize Ukrainian state from private sector, from business, and civil society, because it has quite high trust in a society, could in a way sell those ideas to wider citizens, so that innovation can be faster and that the ideas could go from the bottom up and then turn into policies. So this is my proposal.
In one of the Chatham House polls, it shows that 35% of NGOs believe that, Ukrainian NGOs believe that the mobilization of citizens for protests and pressure on power is the most effective way to achieve change in Ukraine. How it reflects the development level of the society, and how can we change that?
Well, it was visible when, we asked Ukrainian non-government organizations what do they believe is the most effective way, and it was clear that all the more institutionalized instruments such as public hearings, petitions, working groups with the ministries were viewed as less effective, and more direct action, more open citizen mobilization, including for protest, was believed to be more effective. To me, this is an indicator of the problem, that exchange of ideas and this political dialogue that, Prosecutor General Lutsenko was calling is not functioning. It means that either, the state is faking that it's really engaged and wants to listen to the citizens, or the existing mechanisms are not delivering the necessary feedback from citizens to the state. And this is very important, to have these feedback mechanisms be in between elections, because in a way elections is one big feedback that current establishment will receive on its performance. But between elections there has to be this vault where people can express their ideas and feel that they are included. A lot of politics is about feelings and emotions, and in Ukraine, unfortunately, people feel that they are excluded, that they are not listened to, It increases radicalization and it increases violence in society in general.
Thank you. In Ukraine, reforms are passed very slowly and through huge struggles. What do you think is the most effective way to make the reforms fast in Ukraine?
The question, because I cannot hear you well. Maybe closer to the microphone.
Ukraine implements new reforms very slowly and through struggles. What do you think is the most effective way to make the reforms in Ukraine faster?
So in terms of how do you promote reform further, I think we can learn from successes in the past, and that is really the unity and cooperation between different sectors of society, government, private sector, civil society, academia, and I think Ukraine has a very challenging task to reform. It requires a lot of consolidation of, activists, the people committed to drive this process forward. And I think another task that has to happen is retraining of government officials to work in a new way. So in a way, Ukraine has a good starting base for strong human capital, but this capital has to develop. That's why the educational reform is important and professional retraining of government officials to implement the new policy that parliament is voting is also very important.
Thank you. One of the final issues I would like to address is the Ukrainian resistance to the Russia's interference and the pressure, which is one of the key objects of the analysis. The report states that it is an illusion to believe that diplomatic sanctions alone will diminish Russia's determination to dominate in Ukraine. But what will?
It's a very difficult question. I think that the report argues for both consistent political and diplomatic pressure on Russia, and also for increasing the resilience of Ukraine to defend itself. And I think the impressive achievement of Ukraine so far has been that it managed to preserve the independence and sovereignty of its state and build the beginning of an independent professional army. But again, the report says that Ukrainians' vulnerability to Russian influence and aggression are coming often from within, from Ukrainian security services, from infiltration in the police force, from propaganda and use of media inside Ukraine, and from pro-Russian or Russian money inside Ukrainian politics. So what will make Ukraine stronger is more open and accountable institutions. And I think in order to achieve this, it's very important that civil society and activists keep on watching and holding those in power to an account to make sure that security sector is not corrupt, to make sure that the best officers and soldiers who go through the war in the East are promoted to the positions, and to make sure that the Ministry of Defense is accountable to the parliament and to a civilian sector.
Thank you very much for this rigorous report and for the interview. Thanks for your time. We appreciate that very much.